One day I went just down the road to Nogales, Sonora, to serve immigrants who are deported back to Mexico. Busloads and busloads of immigrants are dumped on the U.S.-Mexico border several times a day at that place and many places along the border. We joined a team of U.S. and Mexican volunteers who received these immigrants on the Mexican side of the border, providing them with a glass of cold water, a cup of ramen soup, a change of clothing, a bit of orientation. Our immigrant brothers and sisters are always tired, always dirty, they're always disoriented, and they're always broken. It was there that we washed the feet of immigrants, cutting away the most horrible and enormous black and blue foot blisters I have ever seen. I never thought our feet could go that bad. Then we'd nurse their feet with antibiotic creams, bandaging them finally ever so carefully to not cause more pain upon unbearable pain. It was the last bus, the very last bus of the afternoon, that blessed my life with 10-year-old Joslin and her little brother, her 8-year-old brother, Melvin, and their father. When we saw that bus arrive, we went out to meet all of the immigrants that had been deported, welcoming them, offering them respite, a bit of love, a bit of care. And after all of them had apparently gotten off, we started to walk with them to that care tent that had been set up for them and for our ministry with them. And then somebody said, "There's another one. There's yet another one, and he seems to be hurt." So two of us, my partner who had gone with me, another person from staff, and I had gone together, he and I turned back and looked, and indeed there was one more. It was a man, a young man, who walked with a limp. So we walked towards him and grabbed him on both sides, trying to hold him up, wondering if he'd sprained his ankle, broken his leg, something that happens quite often to immigrants out in the Arizona desert. And he looked at us and he said, I'm tired. I'm tired and I'm weary, but I'm all right. He'd been born with a disability, and thus the limp that we had observed. Once we knew what his condition was, we suddenly realized that he wasn't alone. Hanging on for dear life to his shirt tails were Joslin and Melvin, his children. They were a family from Chiapas, Mexico. This young man's wife, Joslin, and Melvin's mother, was suffering from a very serious illness and was bed-stricken. That husband, that father, had no work, and so his family had no food and absolutely no means to sustain themselves. And the day had come when they had been forced to make the difficult decision to leave home to attempt to reach the U.S. and attain some sustainability for themselves, a measure of care for that wife and that mother back in Chiapas. As I watched that father's dusty and blistered feet, he told me their immigrant story. He was a corn farmer. He'd been left destitute like 2 million other corn farmers in Mexico have been left destitute because of the impact of the North American Free Trade Agreement. I was washing his feet. I was at his feet with a wash basin, and I was hearing his story, but focusing on caring for his battered feet, when a silence came upon us. And I looked up at him, and tears were just flowing down his cheeks. I gulped back my emotions and asked him why he was crying. And he said, "I'm crying because God was so good to us. God was so faithful. But I'm also crying because I remember the day when I thought that I'd lost my little boy." Melvin had apparently become so dehydrated in the desert that he had fainted on the desert floor. They were all alone in a place they did not know. Joslin and Melvin were hanging on to their father's shoulders, listening to their own immigrant story. And after a moment, when I could finally again speak, I looked at Melvin and I said to him, "Melvin, you are such a brave boy." And without ever missing a beat, Melvin looked over his father's shoulders all the way to his sister Joslin, and he said very proudly, "But I'm not as brave as my sister. She never fainted." It was a tender moment of fraternal love between two children who had experienced a life struggle that no child should ever have to face. When we left the care tent and said goodbye to Melvin and to Joslin and to their father, my friend, our staff member, and I looked at each other and instinctively knew what we had to do. And we took all the dollars that we had in our pockets, which weren't many, and we put them together. And I had the privilege of handing them over to Melvin and Joslin's father. They were not the only ones at the end of that long day left at that care tent. But we thought with two children, he needed that help more than anyone else. And so we gave him the money. We'd already said our goodbyes to all of the other immigrants, and Bill and I started to walk away with heavy hearts. We felt the other immigrants holding their breath, expecting that we might help them in a similar way, but we'd given that father all the money that we had on us. It was a difficult moment. We were heavy-hearted. But then all of a sudden, we began to hear a voice of joy, a collective voice of joy, as these immigrants began to say that phrase that you and I know, even if we don't speak Spanish, gracias, hermano. Gracias, hermano. Thank you, brother. Thank you, brother. And I leaned over, and through the corner of my eye, I saw Melvin and Joslin's father taking the little money we had given him and sharing it with all the other immigrants at that care tent. And in that moment, I saw what it means to be a Christian, to think and act like God, to forget one's wife and to forget one's children in the moment in order to help another. And in that moment, I caught a sight and the sound of the very kingdom of God. And I wondered on that day, as I wonder on this day, if you and I can be as faithful as that immigrant father.